Yeah, let's go ahead and get started, just to make sure we use your time well. So welcome. I'm Dawn Thilmany from Colorado State University, who has the pleasure of being on a great team that's coordinated by the USDA, but brought both government, academic, and some great food system supply chain partners together to look at the local regional food system response to COVID-19. And as part of that, we've been developing consumer food insights based on a survey we did in the fall of 2020. So of course, today is going to be highlighting that survey, even though those of you who've been to previous webinars know we've been doing little data bites all along, trying to give people some context about what we were learning about consumer behavior during this time. I'm your moderator today as well, and we'll be speaking a bit, but we actually have a rich set of panelists, which we'll be introducing here in a bit after we set the stage for today's talk. Just to give you a little more information about the project, it was really meant to be several things. One was to actually just realize that a lot of people were dealing with a pretty challenging dynamic all at once, and that, as is in all cases in the world, every time you feel like you have company and some people to actually touch base with, it sometimes makes it a little easier to navigate tough waters. Moreover, we've always known that more cross-sector collaboration across local and regional food systems as they continue to emerge as a really interesting dynamic in the food system probably was much needed even before the COVID pandemic, but this just gave us a really good reason to catalyze those relationships. So USDA had the vision to look across USDA itself and being led by the Ag Marketing Service, tapped a few of us universities to do a lot of work in this area to be partners, and then use both networks they had through the many programs they do to support this sector and the ones we had made through projects we had done, and pulled us all together to really have some rich conversations and really set an agenda for what we could do. So today's webinar is a response to one of the things we heard when we had our initial discussions and listening sessions across the partnerships. We knew that social distancing mandates and the economic disruptions that came after it led to unprecedented changes pretty much across society, but food systems really took center stage in a lot of those discussions. So because of that, and because we all knew we were seeing on the ground in our pockets of the world, but we really didn't know how to map out the whole picture, we decided to do a national survey in fall 2020, and what we had hoped would be towards the end of the pandemic, which we now know wasn't, of 5,000 households that we'll give you various reasons to believe is pretty representative of the population. And so this webinar is kind of the first one that isn't more about a discussion and more about presenting some applied research findings. But in addition, we'll also have some panelists from our partnership who are going to tell you their perspective of what these results mean in the part of the food system they're operating in right now. So again, just to set the kind of tone for what the major themes we both framed the survey to learn about and we'll share about today, is that we knew just from megadata that the shift to more at-home eating was an obvious result. Restaurants had to close, schools closed, universities closed, and that of course reverberated through food marketing channels almost immediately. In addition, and we've all seen this play out, there's been a stark increase in online food purchasing. And we know, again, because food is something we purchase the most frequently of anything in our lives, that was going to play out in this sector, particularly in an interesting way. We had a whole webinar on this last month that we can post a link to, where if you want to learn more about what our focus is on that. But we'll at least today talk about that a little bit too in the context of what it means for markets. And then finally, we know that there's been heightened food security. And what's been really interesting to learn about is how significant of a role local and regional food systems have commonly played in addressing that food insecurity. So we brought that into the discussion today as well. So breaking down those themes a little bit more, for where you're going to see 2, 3, 4 slides each about highlights of what we have found, that we then will invite you to go visit our Consumer Food Insights series to learn more about, are basically what were the triggers for COVID-19? What did the households we talked to talk about, both about how it affected their household economics and their health concerns? Start looking at what that means for restaurant closures and how that's going to show up in a lot of our data today. Then we'll kind of shift gears and really get to the heart of the matter, which is where we saw shifts in consumer food shopping patterns. So when that food away from home and those restaurants closed, that food purchasing, eating, preparation, all had to go somewhere. Well, we've seen a lot of data about this, but what this project did uniquely is it disaggregated the different market channels that we try to capture people and households' behavior in at a more detailed level than we think anyone else has tried to do, because that's really at the heart of the network we're working with. And we're not assuming that's the same across the country. We'll have a really interesting look into how that differs across the US, not just regions of the country, but the size of communities that people are living in. And then, of course, like I said, we'll be talking a bit about that steep growth in online orders and what that might mean for the future of local and regional food systems. Finally, we'll kind of settle up with a little more nuanced discussion of how consumers differed in their behavior and choices they made during this time, all the way from what some of their perceptions and food values were to how it might have affected them because of either food insecurity or time use challenges they faced in their household. So as you can see, we have a large set of data to get through. So we're going to be moving at a pretty good clip, but know that we'll do our best to answer questions in the chat box as well. To set the stage for how most of our survey is organized, in addition to those big themes, we had to pick some timeframes for when we felt like were the major pivot points of what was going on in the dynamics. So we call September 2019 the before time, when no one even knew what the acronym COVID meant, and we were probably all, this picture shows we were all probably a bit more carefree. Then, of course, April 2020 is when we really perceived was the most clear date that there was a clear lockdown in place for the entire country, so that if there was any effect to catch of what households were doing newly in the food market space, that would be the best time to capture that kind of first effect. And then, of course, right before we gave this survey in October, we kind of try to capture where people had settled into as their new normal in September 2020. So you're going to see those 3 dates referred to quite often. The other thing you're going to see referred to quite often is market channels, and we'll give you a link to help you keep track of those here in a bit. But let's first talk a little bit about what we even asked these households about how COVID was impacting them. And we really put that into 2 major categories. First, we wanted to know how it economically impacted them. And that's going to come obviously pretty significantly into the food insecurity discussion. But also, if you think about even just how people may be changing their time allocation. So we had about half of our sample that really didn't see an impact, but as you can see, most of those other half that were impacted, it was in a negative way. So there was some major economic hit to their household, with the exception of about 5% where all of a sudden they got busier, probably because of the line of business they were in. The other thing people perceived as a risk, of course, was what the health impacts would be to their household. And luckily, we had a lot of households that said that there was likely no COVID risk, experience, or person in their household that was very susceptible. But there was 25% who, probably beyond what was actually required of the government orders, were perhaps making some different choices just because of their perceived risk for their household. The other thing we always look at when we do surveys is obviously how representative it is. Well, for some of our categories, it was quite representative. You can see both by income and their self-defined ethnic categorization. We had a fairly representative sample of the United States. The one place we didn't have a representative sample, but we expected that, is we weigh a little heavily towards women, but that's because we did ask that the survey be referenced to the person in the household mostly responsible for food shopping and preparation. So even though that's getting more balanced than it used to be in history, that's still primarily a woman function in many households. We did break down the ethnicity a little bit more specifically for the Hispanic and Latino community. And as you can see, this is fairly representative of what we know to be present in US households. Another thing we did in the income categorization for 2 reasons was we broke it down by income quintile, which is just a fancy way of saying lowest 20%, next 20%, next 20%. So that middle 20% you could call both the middle class and like what an average household was. Well, we checked both what we knew from US data to be average amount a median household was spending on food, and we matched it against what we asked in our survey. This is one way we kind of validate to make sure what we're learning and what people are recalling as their food purchases line up with the actual data that we know to be true. So it's another way to just check that our data is correct. But more importantly, particularly for the food insecurity discussion, we had to remember that even though we brag as a country about a very low share of our household income going to food, for some of our households, that is not the case at all. And it's actually a fairly significant part of what they they spend their income on. So these decisions are even more critical to their everyday sustenance. Another way we can look at how we collected these responses is geographically. And so 2 things to notice here. Yes, these are very blocked in large cities, but that's actually what the United States looks like now. We just had these discussions along with election 2. A huge part of 80% of our population lives in large metro areas. So we do see a lot of clumping there, but we luckily do see a lot of our rural and non-metro counties spanning across the country. And Jairus in his discussion later is going to do a little deeper dive on that, but this is just to show you kind of spatial representation in the survey. So the last thing I want to show you, and this isn't from our survey, is just again to set the stage. We have known for a very long time that those red and blue bars show we've had we up until last year had a continued convergence of people spending almost the exact same amount of money on food that they eat at home as they spend on the food they eat away from home. What the green bar shows you is how significant of a dive both spending on food made post-pandemic, so that April 2020 we're going to reference in the survey, but then the difference between the blue bar and the red bar shows you again how big of a hit restaurants made, no matter how savvy they were about pivoting to online sales. So that is one of the big significant dynamics we're going to always keep referencing today. So again, as you're thinking about this presentation as we move through, know we're going to kind of very hopefully smoothly move between discussions on food at home, food away from home, which is our restaurant sector, and they were part of our partnership, and how we acquire food otherwise, not through markets, but perhaps through food assistance programs and other food systems partners we have. So with that, we've set the stage for the survey, but we also want to introduce you to some people who are going to give us some great insights about what all this data means when it comes right down to it. And so let me introduce our speakers for today, and then I'm going to have them give a short little biography about the organizations they're affiliated with, and some opening comments. So first, we have Dar Wolniak, and Dar has been the national advocate and trainer for farmers markets for more than 20 years. Her pre-market careers included human resource positions, community organizing, and small business projects before serving a decade as the Market Umbrella's deputy director. While on staff there, she designed and ran one of the first free farmers market resource sites in the US. And since then, Dar has consulted for dozens of markets, assisting with design, operations, data collection, and analysis support. She has worked for the Farmers Market Coalition, a partner on this project since its inception, and joined the staff in 2015. Jimmy Wright is with Wright Food Solutions, but also represents for this project that he plays a strong affiliation with the National Grocers Association. Wright's Market began 46 years ago as a 2,100 square foot convenience store under a different name and a different owner, but has always been operated by a Wright. They help to meet the fresh food needs in areas such as Huntsboro and La Chapaca, and is a federal grant that allows the store to offer half off fresh produce. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the incentive programs for healthy food, and he's been an innovator in his region in that space. He's also been an award winner many times for the innovations he does to bring fresh produce to his region of the country. But more importantly now, he serves as a spokesperson nationally for bringing those same programs to more pockets of the country. We're excited to have you here today, Jimmy. And in a second, I'll let you probably do a better job of explaining that than I will. Andy Olive is with the Food Access Program Director at Fresh Approach in California. He has been working to build resilient food systems since 2014. In that time, he has been particularly focused on increasing the linkages between small-scale, mission-driven farms to communities who have historically been denied access to healthy food landscapes. He has developed a unique program and interventions around the country and was particularly innovative this year, which is part of the reason we asked him to be on the panel, and hope he shares some of those insights. So with that, I'm going to let you quickly turn it over to our panelists in that same order for them to give a short introduction about how they've seen this play out with their organizations, and then we'll return and get back to the survey findings. Dar?
Thanks, Dawn. That was a great intro, such a good intro to what we're going to talk about today. Of course, Farmers Market Coalition is very excited about this report and being part of this. Farmers Market Coalition is a national membership organization. We represent farmers markets across the US, and so we work on behalf of what we like to think of as the farmers market operator. We often use that language because for the almost 9,000 farmers market sites, there is a group or an individual or some community helping to develop the programs and the goals of that market site. It could be volunteer, it could be part-time staff, it could be partnerships, but there are operators of every farmers market, and those folks are who we primarily support through resource development, technical assistance, networking, advocacy, anything else we could do. And of course, in this particular moment of COVID, it became very clear to us very quickly because the farmers market field is so interactive with us. We're writing, calling us immediately in last spring, telling us what was happening at their market sites, what was happening in their states, what they were being told they could do and they could not do. And so we had the ability to be able to respond quickly because we had so many operators who were willing to not only tell us what was happening, but to tell us what they were doing in response to that, which was so exciting. And added to that, we also worked directly with a very large group of state and network leaders. Some of them are official farmers market associations, actual entities, and some of them are network leaders on different programs. But all of them were also focusing on figuring out what we could do to help these farmers market sites respond to this need and respond as quickly as they could. In addition to that, Farmers Market Coalition also works with the National Grocers Association Foundation as a lead, one of the leads on the Nutrition Incentive Technical Assistance Program that is led by Gretchen Swanson Center for Nutrition and Fair Food Network. So we represent and facilitate the technical assistance to those grantees that are working with farmers markets and other farm direct sites supporting them on that. So we learned a great deal on this program as well from listening to those grantees and how they responded to issues such as not being able to process SNAP if markets were not actually open physically. So there was a lot we learned from this. And of course, the main thing we've learned, as we've talked about many times, is that farmers market operators were asked to do a great deal of design changing and program development very, very quickly, and mostly did that on their own without a lot of support from any other entity, especially from those civic, entities that were asking so much of farmers markets and other entities, grocery stores as well, to pivot and to support the need for getting food out to the communities. And so markets had to spend a lot of time making sure that folks understood that markets could do that. They could open safely and they could make sure that good, healthy food was available to their community. And maybe that was going to be through drive-through or curbside or some other version. So it was quite a year for farmers markets. And as Dawn said, it's certainly not over. And we're certainly starting to see some of the effect of that on our farmers markets as well. But that in a nutshell is what we'll talk more about. And we're, of course, just still learning about what the consumers are thinking about in terms of what they learned through farmers markets last year in this. And certainly we saw some changes in that, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And we will be hearing from Dar again. Jimmy, do you want to give a little bit of an intro as well?
Sure. Again, appreciate the opportunity to share with you all today. Jimmy Wright. I am owner of Wright's Market in East Alabama. It's a store that I began working on, as Dawn said earlier. I worked here as a student in school, and I can safely say that the last year was been the most interesting of all the other 46 years that we have been here. So we have our retail store here, and also have an e-commerce program that I operate under the Right to You banner. And that's, we were perfect timing on that one, so to speak, as we were one of the stores in the online SNAP pilot project from USDA and FNS. And we were able to launch the online SNAP pilot approximately 1 week before the first wave of pandemic buying started. We saw our e-commerce orders in general. We were processing, fulfilling more orders in 1 day than we typically would fulfill in a whole week. We saw our inside business in the store double almost overnight. And of course, all the challenges with supply chain, I'm sure we'll talk as we go on. We also are involved here at the store in the Gus SNP, and our grant's actually under the FINI program. We operate the Double Up Food Bucks program in partnership with Fair Food Network, and we've had great success with that. In my other life, I do some work with National Grocers Association. And one thing that I've done in my retail store, just as a point of interest, is that we actually supply a small store in Atlanta, Georgia, Carver Market. And that store was actually focused on a segment of 60 Minutes last night. So if you guys want to watch something, it is a great story. 60 Minutes did a segment on health in the African American community. And this store we opened about 6 years ago. So all over you on the call, I sure am into the space of food access and food security. And it was a great segment. Just so proud of the folks that we work with over there. We're their supplier. So just a little add on to that. But in National Grocers, we're working with the FNS and Gretchen Swanson and Fair Food on the Double Up Food Bucks programs across the country. But happy to share, all that's happened this last year, and really appreciate the research, time, and efforts gone into this.
Thanks, Jimmy. And as you guys are quickly learning, we probably could feature an hour on each of these panelists. So hard to just hear a couple minutes from them. And if anybody has a link to that 60-minute story, please put it in the chat box. And finally, let's go to Andy Olive with the Fresh Approach.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. My name is Andy Olive. I'm the Food Access Program Director at Fresh Approach. We are a nonprofit in the Bay Area with programs in food security, food as medicine, community agriculture, all with a local food system bent. In our COVID response year, we ran what we think was a unique hub and spoke model as a contractor in the USDA Farmers to Families Food Box project. In that project, we led a network of 8 organizations who represented the spread of the food system in food system nonprofits, urban farms, farmers markets, farms, to implement a box project that ultimately was reaching 3,500 households every week, supporting 50 farms and distributing food to 50 community-based organizations in 7 counties. The perspective I'd like to share today is about how COVID demonstrated in many ways how effective local farmers were at responding to the pandemic in the Bay and around the country, while really providing food with the greatest level of quality and dignity to the families who needed it. We think this success points to how we should permanently make space in the hunger relief ecosystem for local farms. And we believe a lot of the interventions that took place, like ours and others, are immediately ready for scale and further investment. And like the others, Dar and Jimmy, we also have been a long participant in, excuse me, in Finney and GusNIP projects. And in the COVID year, we really just saw how successful that model was, how much it grew, and how much more we should ultimately be investing in it. So excited to talk more about that later.
Thanks so much. And again, you all, we will tell you many times, we appreciate you being here today because this brings the data to life for sure. So in addition to our panelists, you'll be hearing from a variety of speakers who I won't take the time to introduce formally now, but they will introduce themselves as they speak. And this is part of, again, that USDA team brought together to explore this. And a large team of us have been taking different parts of this very long survey and trying to tell interesting stories with that. So with that, let's get a little more specifically into what we found are the COVID-19 impacts happening in local and regional food systems. So first, we're going to take a little bit of a dive into market channel use and expenditures. We all now have heard a couple times that obviously food away from home got drastically affected by restaurant closures. Just to set the stage for what we're talking about when we talk about magnitudes. Usually when data on markets is presented, you'll only see those 2 big categories. The what goes at food for home, which we assume mostly goes through large format grocery stores, and then what goes through restaurants. Well, as what we'll post in the chat box right now, what we did with this survey is for our survey respondents, we asked them to go a little bit deeper in thinking about exactly where they were getting their food for home. Because if we don't do that detailed of breakdown, we don't capture a lot of the dynamic that's happening through local and regional food systems. So right now they're posting a link in the chat box where you can go, and just to keep reference of the different buckets that we put markets into, this is kind of a high level overview, and then we'll be digging a little bit deeper. But obviously, again, large format grocery stores are the primary way people in the United States get the majority of their groceries. Restaurants used to be a bigger chunk. They took a little bit of a hit this time, and we'll be talking about acquisition as well. But since that's not a market per se, that comes in a different part of our presentation. Then we kind of group some categories together here. Those boxes we just heard Andy talk about, and the meal kits, which have been a delivery mechanism that was emerging even before this event. We put together farmers markets and other sales people make direct from producers, whether those are CSAs, farm stands, or now a lot of farms are delivering themselves online. Limited selection markets, those are things like dollar stores, corner stores, you know, relatively smaller footprints, less variety of foods to choose from. And then the niche, independent, and specialty stores, and this would include Right Foods we just heard about, you know, that whole gamut from those independent grocers who are staying in place on main streets to those butchers, bakers, cheese shops, and fish shops we saw were already emerging and got a little bit of boost from this activity. And we'll talk about that a little more specifically as we move on. So the first thing we wanted to know is who really made a change? Where was there a dynamic? And for 2/3 of our households, they really admitted they didn't make a big change. But still, that left 1/3 of the US households that made some significant change in using new markets after this event happened in April. So you can see the breakdown here that all the way from 2 or 3% that were using food boxes and farmers markets anew to really there was a bigger chunk, that 17% we see, who they weren't just using one new market, they were trying a whole new portfolio of markets and ways to get their food access, probably all for different reasons. And even though those numbers might seem small to you, you have to remember the United States is a very big food market. So even if we only see 3% of households newly using a market, that's 36 million new households. That's a very big dynamic and a much bigger shift than we would see in a typical year any other time in US food systems. So it's worth exploring more, and that's exactly what we're doing today. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Rocker, because in addition to asking them about where they shopped newly, we also wanted to know how they found those markets, and Sarah did a little bit of exploration there.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and hello to everybody. So from that slice of the pie that Dawn was talking about of the consumers that tried a new sort of local and regional food market, so not the large format grocery store, but these other market channels, we asked consumers, how did they find out about this new market? And what we did is we actually coded the open text response to this question, you know, how did you find these new categories? And we actually had over 1,500 open text responses, which we qualitatively coded and categorized into these categories that you see here. Word of mouth being the most prevalent. It's also somewhat the most generic kind of umbrella term, and followed by the internet, which a lot of the subcategories underneath that really was people actively getting on the internet and looking at either Google or other searches to find a new market. Followed by local interaction or local source, which were things like doing a drive-by in their neighborhood or walking into a local business and getting a recommendation from a shopkeeper about another place that they should try, or also just a local reputation that is known in the neighborhood or by the community of a great new place to try. Then followed by social media, which includes things like Facebook, Instagram, etc. And then followed by concerted advertising. So when folks knew that they were being advertised, which sometimes that's embedded within social media, other times that came through things like radio and news. And then the other media category actually was a lot about news programs. So when there was a local news article or story featuring a local business. The next slide. We actually went a little bit deeper with these categories, and we broke down, as you see, these kind of two main distinctions that we talk about in this survey, the food at home market channels versus the food away from home market channels. And what you're seeing here listed out by each market channel is from top to bottom, the top categories that were listed by each market channel. So again, what this is representing is how when folks tried a farmer's market for the first time, they found the farmer's market. And in this case, local interaction, so that being physically proximal, was the way that most of our consumer respondents found the farmer's market. For the direct to producer on farm sales or CSA, the internet was the top cited way that folks were finding this new market. For food box delivery, the internet. and in bakery and specialty, internet and local interaction. So there's a lot of different things that we're looking at here. What we find here in this sort of preliminary results is sort of patterns in the presence and absence of these categories by market channel. And a few things to note here. Local interaction, so that physically walking by, drive by, is present in all categories except for the food box delivery. Perhaps not very surprising given that most food box delivery is an online marketed and mostly online shopping experience. Also, advertising, so paid advertisements, shows up very prevalently in all of these market channels, except for farmers markets, direct farm sales, and CSA. And for anyone who's in those markets, maybe you think about your own advertising budget, and that might make some logical sense there. Also, the use of online apps to find a new market channel only showed up in the local and independent restaurant. Also, perhaps not surprising given the prevalence of apps such as Grubhub that consumers are using more increasingly to find things. And then finally, another interesting finding here that's just a pattern from what we've seen, social media is present in all of these categories of market channels. However, it is always less frequently mentioned than local interaction. And this is really interesting given the pandemic. So even though this past year, we have seen a rise in consumers using online and phone orders, contactless pickup and delivery services to get food, the prevalence of local interaction for finding new markets, even in a pandemic, is not going away or has not gone away. So that means despite everything, folks are still getting around, they're walking, they're doing drive-bys, they're walking into local businesses and hearing recommendations. And I think that's a really interesting finding for what has happened as well as what may happen in the future. So future attributes that we're going to be looking at as we parse out this data more are how the attributes of gender, income, and rural-urban dimensions impact these linkages of how people find new markets. For example, using location data that we have in other parts of the survey to see where internet and broadband access may have impacted someone's ability to use the internet to find a new market. And when that's not present, other ways that they might be accessing that, maybe how local interaction, for example, could be more interesting and more useful for rural folks to access these markets. That's just a hypothesis that we have yet to test. So to sum this up, we really hope that this kind of data around the linkages of how people are finding new markets is useful both for producers as well as market operators to understand the strategies of how consumers have been reached during the pandemic. And hopefully this can influence how folks can reach and retain customers moving forward. I'll pass it back to my research team.
Thank you, Sarah. And so with the sharing of those first insights from the survey, we want to come back to the panel, and particularly I think we'll ask Dar to give us a couple of her insights on which of these consumer changes we've started to highlight were the most surprising to you in spring 2020. And you already kind of mentioned some of these, but how did you and others in your farmers market sector respond? And I'll start with Dar, and if any of the other ones want to chime in, that would be great as well.
Yeah, this is so interesting, of course, and so great to listen to, because, you know, to think about local interaction and social media as being the ways that people found farmers markets, even in this situation, I think is probably a little surprising to farmers market operators, in the sense that not as social media we know is strong for farmers markets. Farmers market operators have put a lot of effort into social media. So that is not surprising that continues to be a way for folks to find the information they need about the markets, even during shutdowns and pandemic, mitigation. But what's interesting about it is that a lot of farmers market operators a lot of them had to shift where they were located. Because of the pandemic, they were not allowed to use the space that maybe they couldn't mitigate the effects of social distancing or whatever else they needed to do. And so a lot of market operators reported to us that they were forced to seek new locations for their markets during that time. And so that interest, that of course seems to suggest that they probably were negatively affected if the main way that people were finding farmers markets were going out to look for them, trying to find them and driving around or looking for them. And I thought it was over here, and it wasn't there. And that was certainly true for many of us, including here in New Orleans, the market sites that they had originally normally used long-term, they were not using for a while. So we were definitely, I think the consumers were definitely struggling to find farmers markets in a lot of cases if they weren't already attached to them on social media and knowing the differences between them. So that is important. I think we are definitely hearing that a lot. I think we also know that, as I think Sarah mentioned too, there's the difference between what the vendors found and what the market operators find has been a bit of a, there's a lot of difference in there, and I think we'll talk a lot more about that. But certainly, there were vendors market vendors, farmers market vendors who were not coming to town and finding other ways to set up their sales and, deciding to go on their own, but didn't have a strong social media presence, didn't have sites available to them. And so shifted to a completely different way to sell their items, whether through an online platform, which we'll talk more about. But the consumers that did find markets certainly were telling us that we definitely thought that we were seeing the informal information we got were that we were seeing a lot of new people new to farmers markets, in examples where we talked to vendors and said, yeah, I'm seeing people I just had never seen before. So the local interaction may very well have been that people found them that had never found them before because they were setting up in new places. And so it's a really interesting thing around design and retail design and how we set all of that up. Certainly, we're not surprised by the kind of information that we're hearing here. And of course, a lot of farmers markets did pivot to some of those other opportunities, creating market box programs, shifting the support to vendors directly and not opening themselves. So the interaction between the different, the sales between the different channels is obviously really important. A lot of markets are paying more attention to how their vendors might be using box programs and CSAs and their own farm stands and other programs to get food to them, especially trying to change. And I think that's how we've seen them respond. I think we are still wondering. We definitely saw also that that shoppers who were not finding farming, were not coming to farmers markets. Anecdotally, we were hearing that they were planning on coming back. They just were going to take a little break from doing it. They didn't want to be out in public, things like that. So, the long-term effects of this are very interesting to us too. We definitely saw some major impacts to farmers numbers in the short term. But yeah, that's kind of my initial take.
Yeah, and thank you much. I do think I'm going to keep us going, but we'll be hearing from the other panelists here in a couple minutes on other topics. But I should have said this up front. As you can see, we have an active chat box. So if you think of questions you want to ask the panelists, please do include them there. We'll be stopping every 4 or 5 slides or so. And so these are the exact kind of insights. And I see an active set of questions going. A couple other things I should have highlighted at the start. We're going through this very quickly because we wanted to cover the highlights of a lot of topics. There is a consumer food insight series that has written up in more detail almost all of these findings. We're going to make this presentation posted and available, and we can make the slide deck available. So don't worry about capturing specific statistics. We can get those to you. And we know we're moving quickly, but we again wanted to give you more of a sense of what all we have found and you can learn more about than to do a deep dive on any one thing. I'll keep moving, and thank you, Dar. So the next thing that we looked at is a little bit more about details of where some of these changes look different. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Jairus Rossi.
Hi, thanks, Don. Yeah, I'm Jairus Rossi. I'm a research professor at University of Kentucky, and my interests really here lie in the spatial component of the survey data. Specifically, we expected that community size might impact how consumers purchased food during the pandemic. Why? Well, I mean, community size may be related to the ability to access specific market channel options. And there's a differential experience of COVID. Some places had restrictions on what market channels could operate and how and when. And the relative intensity of the pandemic was different in different places at different times. So geography matters. And here's a very basic map that I made of where our survey respondents are located. I used the RUC codes to split up responses by population size. So what we have here in red are metro regions above 1 million, blue is metro regions below 1 million, and yellow is non-metro counties. Right, and so in the next slide, I will focus on market channels that you might expect to find local food. So I've included supermarkets for comparison here, and these percentages represent increases or decreases in expenditures, in weekly expenditures, on average for individuals taking these surveys for each market channel at the beginning of the pandemic compared to what we had called originally the before times. Okay, so April 2020, start of the pandemic, September 2019 is the before time. So in other words, when the lockdowns and restrictions took hold, when we were originally trying to figure out what was going on with this pandemic, how did our spending patterns change, and how is that reflected geographically? So generally, people started spending more per week at supermarkets, so in spending less in all of the local food oriented channels. And some of these changes, you know, compared to the previous fall, are obviously seasonal, so the farmers markets would fall in there. But we do see things like a small increase in purchases directly from farmers. So CSAs would be an example in larger metro areas. Other changes are probably effective COVID restrictions. In particular, if you look at the local restaurants, very sharp decrease everywhere in April compared to September before. And then in smaller metro areas, which is the blue bar, we do see an increase in spending at smaller format groceries. So independent grocery stores, co-ops, Trader Joe's, I think, is in that category. So perhaps here there was a movement towards less crowded places or stores with really well-defined safety policies. All right, so the next slide, we have the evolution in expenditures in September 2020 compared to April 2020. So people started figuring out their food acquisition strategies as well as what they saw as their own acceptable level of risk. So here we see, so this can be considered spending patterns during the new normal compared to the initial shock. So the most obvious trend here is that people started spending more in most of the local market channels, regardless of community size. We do see a sharp increase in direct from farmer purchases in both large metro and non-metro counties. We also see an increased expenditure in local restaurants as in all community sizes, though this may reflect increased costs of operating delivery or takeout services, as well as a general rebound once some of the restrictions were eased and people became more adventurous, I guess. Finally, people in non-metro counties spent more in small format groceries. Again, that would be co-ops and IGAs. All right, so that's the next slide. We have, I'm offering a comparison of expenditures 1 year apart for all market channels that we surveyed, so not just the local food channels. And this reflects sort of the overall changes in weekly expenditure from the before times to the new normal. Right, so in general, consumers spent more per week at supermarkets and superstores, large format grocery. But we also see expenditures in convenience and discount groceries in both metro communities sizes and a bit of a decrease in rural areas. And then increased expenditures at small format grocery overall is only seen in smaller metro counties. I think that's the blue again. And so then the next slide, we have more of the locally focused channels, and there are more profound changes here. The expenditures on farmers markets were up for all community sizes, though the smaller metro class had the largest increase. Direct from producer expenditures, so that would be CSAs and online orders from farmers, that only increased in larger metro communities and actually dropped in the other two size classes. Aggregated food boxes, so not CSAs, and meal kits had large expenditures increases in all community sizes. And then finally, spending at specialty markets, which included delis, bakeries, fish markets, etc. It increased in large metro areas and decreased in the smaller communities. Okay, so the final slide then. Place matters, and there's probably very interesting regional differences in how residents engaged with different markets during the pandemic. Don't have enough samples to really get into a lot of the regional differences, but we're hoping to get into some of them as things go, as this effort progresses. So and then Haley, once she talks, she'll tell you, even though geography does matter, online platforms may be flattening the geography of food purchasing in some ways, but I'm not, I think, are we having the panelists speak now?
Yeah, I think, Jairus, I think Jimmy was going to speak up here, and particularly Jimmy, I think you have an interesting perspective because you're operating in one of these more rural areas, but because of your innovation you mentioned of the store you have helped seed in Atlanta, I think you have the best perspective to talk about this particular spatial difference, which is more rural areas versus urban areas.
Yes, as I said earlier, our business doubled almost overnight. A few things that we did, I believe, that helped our community navigate this. We were the very first ones to move on any kind of safety measures in our community. We were the first ones up in store with the plexiglass barriers at the registers, face coverings, decals on the floor. So we knew this was an issue that our customers and our community were going to look to us first as the local merchant. And so we got out in front of that, and then communicating about you know, who we were and what we had every day as far as the amount of product we had and we did not have. So you know, certainly the out of stock started pretty quickly. We were able really to have some other opportunities open up. One being food service operators where the restaurants closed had products that they could not sell with the restaurants being closed. So we were able to access that and help the supply situation. And we were also able to, some of the farmers where the markets is closed, we're able to help those people move those products also. So we moved very quickly on safety. We communicated very effectively. And then we had sources of supply that helped us navigate this. Our friends of Atlanta, again, if you back to the Carver Market Group at Atlanta, they saw their business really, really increase dramatically as being the only store in a food desert. So, you know, it just was, it was a very quick response and listening to the customers in making these trends. Our business is still up. It's not up as much as it was last year, but we have retained some of this even with the opening of restaurants back in our community. So
thank you so much, Jimmy. And I think the other interesting thing you mentioned when we had our conversation the other day is that the foot traffic is down a little bit, but the per customer purchases continue. People are doing more purchases in large amounts and less frequent trips, as I think you said too. So I think that's interesting and probably aligns with probably some of what we're going to hear when we talk about online markets here in a second. So again, thank you very much. And let's move to exactly that discussion. So Haley, if you want to take over on sharing what we found with online shopping trends. And again, we start this section just sharing with you all that online grocery accounts now for about 21% of total grocery sales. So it went from being a drop in the bucket to a pretty significant dynamic to track. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Haley.
Great, thank you, Dawn. So just kind of touching again on what we talked about, one of the mega trends we kind of saw during COVID was this increase across the board in the rate of online shopping that people were doing in the food sector. And this graph just shows overall the share of respondents to the survey who used online purchasing in either curbside or for delivery across the 3 time periods in any channel. So we can see a large increase from September 19 to April 2020, which can kind of be expected. And then what's interesting here is actually the persistence between April 2020 to September 2020, indicating that consumers are continuing to shop online even after that initial shock and onset of restrictions in the spring. So what about online shopping in specific market channels? Some market channels experienced a much greater share of their consumers shopping online. And this figure shows the share of shoppers at each of these market channels who are purchasing using online platforms at that channel. So across the channels, the use of online shopping has increased. But what's interesting is that some of these smaller, more direct from producer and specialty channels like smaller format grocery stores, farmers markets and direct from producers, food boxes and meal kits, actually began with a higher rate of online usage even before COVID and maintain a higher portion of online usage in September 2020 compared to the more traditional supermarket and supercenter channels. So another kind of interesting thing that we wanted to look at was the share of consumers who are using online shopping methods by age. We might think that sometimes the older consumer population might be more or less likely to adopt online shopping technology, but we see the first three age groups are almost identical in their use of online channels across the 3 time periods, and then it starts to kind of dip after age 44. But you can see across time and across age groups, online shopping usage has just continued to increase. So kind of like Juris was saying, even though the use of online might not be the same across all market channels or geography, it has kind of, we see it increasing across time and across demographics pretty consistently. So we also wanted to look at consumer values and confidence around food to capture, especially since we're talking about a lot of local channels, how consumer values might play a role in behavior changes in the past year. So we looked at 2 different things. Values, which could kind of be considered the intensity of concern around a specific area like local food or the local economy. And we also have something called perceived consumer effectiveness, which we asked respondents about, which is kind of a psychology term for confidence in your ability to affect your environment via your behavior. So does where I buy food and how I buy food actually matter? And we focused on 2 specific areas: local food in the local economy and COVID kind of public health perceptions and behaviors around public health. So this figure is showing some of those confidence questions that we asked. The darker blue bars being a stronger agreement with the statement. And I'll just point to this first one. The statement is, doing my part to reduce the spread of COVID-19 is important to me. And we saw almost 70% of the sample either agree or strongly agree with this statement, which was one of the strongest responses we had on any of these like confidence questions. And so kind of taking that, thinking about if respondents so strongly agree with reducing the spread of COVID being important to them, how might it affect behavior like their use of online shopping, where shopping online might be a behavior you could participate in to reduce your, spreading or interacting with other people in a grocery store. So we do see that these 2 different groups are those who strongly agree that reducing the spread of COVID is important to them, and the other group is either neutral or they disagree, it's not necessarily important to them. And we see that the group that agrees with the reducing the spread of COVID does have a higher rate of using online shopping compared to the other group. But we also see that both of these groups increase their usage over time. Again, so this gives us a little bit of insight into the fact that this adoption of online shopping might go beyond just the kind of impact of reducing the spread of COVID or public health concerns. So again, these are some of the questions that we asked about local food in the local economy. And we wanted to capture some of those values and confidence around purchases that have to do with local market channels, whether or not a product is locally grown. And we'll actually focus on this statement, the value someone places on their food being locally grown. So this shows the share of shoppers at a market channel who think that locally grown is a really important attribute to their food, or is a more neutral or is unimportant to them. So we see on this left side are these more small specialty channels, direct channels, and across the board, there is a large difference in the groups that the group that values local tends to participate in these channels a lot more. So these channels kind of see that local bump, if you want to call it that. But what's interesting is if we look at the food away from home channels, and Dawn has been talking a lot about that food away from home and how restaurants have really experienced a great challenge in the past year. The local independent restaurants really don't see a difference from the traditional restaurant channels. So unfortunately, unlike some of the farmers markets and food boxes, the local independent restaurants really haven't seen that local bump in consumption.
Yeah, so just to take a little bit of a deeper dive into that same concept that Haley just introduced, and we're going to look at like what that means for dollars spent. So unlike the absolute dollar changes that Jairus presented earlier, what we did is I went ahead and actually calculated the expenditure shares of what share of a household's food budget was spent in different locations. And in this top line, you'll see that that's broken out across, again, some of these categories where we did some combining just to have a few less categories. But for a usual US household, you can see that, again, large format grocery stores get the majority of those food dollars per week, but they're distributed throughout. But if we take the subset of people who either highly valued locally grown, highly valued having local food products available in the stores, or wanting to know that their purchase supports the food business they're buying from, you can see those shares change a bit. So let's look at as locally grown. So all of a sudden you see about $50 less spent at a local grocery store if we use kind of the median amount people spend, and that gets distributed in an interesting way across niche, independent, and specialty stores, limited selection stores, farmers markets, and boxes and meal kits. And again, we're not seeing huge changes, but even $11 a month additional from the households that focus on local foods can end up being actually a fairly big aggregate number for the United States as a whole. So this is just an example, again, of where we see it's not just people visiting these markets, but we're actually seeing fairly interesting shifts into different channels that are part of the local and regional food system. But particularly, we can't treat every consumer as average, and that those differences are going to be influenced by both people who value things, but also how well those markets and enterprises and farms and businesses within them share their story enough for them to feel like they are assured it's locally grown, that there are local products in that market if it's an independent grocery, or if it's an independent restaurant, that they're carrying local items on their menu, and that any evidence you can give in your business that you're supporting that food business, that it got to hire back an employee because their business is up and so forth. Those seem to be like the signals these people are looking for. And now let me draw your eye to the boxes and meal kits, which is something we haven't talked about much. We definitely know that phenomena grew because they are an online option and online grew. But we also know, and we weren't clever enough to disentangle this in our survey, that farms to family food box program may be entangled in that response, because that became a huge phenomena that no one expected to see coming too. So we'll be turning to that a little bit when we start talking about food acquisitions. But again, a lot of data on this slide, but know that it's available in a newly posted Consumer Food Insight if you want to look at it in more detail. So now let's turn back to our panelist again and talk a little bit about those two things we just talked about, that online shift and what it meant for local and regional food farms, ranches, and food businesses, and how you see those food values and consumer decisions playing out in discussions you're having. I do want to remind folks, we did turn this into an hour-and-a-half webinar because we were having such rich discussions. So we know some of you might need to go, but we do plan on going for another half hour or so. But if you have to top off, know that we are posting this whole webinar within the next week or so you can watch it if you do need to go. But with that, I think we'll start perhaps with Andy, but this is one where I wouldn't mind all three of you weighing in a little bit about both what happened with that online shift and where you see food values playing out in your business strategy. Andy, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, so in the food security world and my own, online hasn't been that much of our focus. What I can speak to is the thing you were just talking about, which is the entanglement of the box programs with emergency box programs. Based on the numbers I see in your survey, my best guess is those numbers represent online CSA type programs. What I saw at the beginning of COVID, and again, this isn't my world, but we did see a large increase in CSA purchases, and a lot of those do happen online. But where we saw that growth was in farms that already had CSA programs. So a lot of the farms we work with are BIPOC, Latinx growers, many of whom didn't have CSA projects and weren't able to pivot very quickly, especially figuring out the online component. So in our efforts with our box project, we tried to prioritize those farms. And in some cases, the farms we work with use that as an opportunity to learn how to build their own CSA program. So it was validating, I think, to see growth in CSA, which in our field has been a struggle. And I think there's opportunity to go further. But that's sort of the extent of my experience doing online work, because it hasn't been a particularly successful area for reaching low income, low access communities.
Thank you much. And Dar, I'm sure you have some insights on this as well.
Yeah, that's really well said, Andy. For those shoppers who are using benefit programs, online sales we just have no ability to do that. Online SNAP is not a thing for direct to consumer yet. And of course, for the other programs, they pretty much are still in paper voucher format. So this is a real struggle to not leave behind a group of our shoppers who we had already begun to include and in more markets and in more other ways of selling local food in the last 10 years, because we simply had to figure it out. So I think we saw that. That's true that we didn't see a big shift in terms of benefit program shoppers like SNAP or a Farmers Market Nutrition Program, because they simply couldn't be handled this way. But it's true that I think a lot of what we hear from markets, that a lot of their direct marketing farmers took the leap into technology and very quickly. And I think Andy's absolutely right. If they were already doing a CSA, they were successful. We did not see a lot of new CSAs from farmers who hadn't done those before. But in turn, we did see a lot of markets who decided to go ahead and create what we call market box programs, where there's a bit of a aggregation by the market or a group of farmers for the shoppers, and using online pre-order, pickup. All of that was a huge change in farmers markets in this year. I think it's interesting looking at that number, at the difference in the high number of people that were already using online sales in direct to consumer and direct marketing farmers and in farmers markets on the slide earlier. My feeling is that's probably a lot of farmers who were already in that place. A lot of markets were not in that place of creating online pre-order platforms. They are now. We have about a half dozen developers who are doing some really interesting work with farmers markets to help build those platforms so that they can have a little bit of flexibility. But I do think we are seeing that more. We're seeing more direct marketing farmers focus on the online online sales over the long period. But I do hear from farmers markets that they're going to keep those online sales platforms available. They think it definitely increased their shopping base in terms of some new shoppers. So I think we always are thinking about how we're going to attract younger shoppers to farmers markets. It's always been a bit of an issue, of course. And then I think the other thing is really just to keep to allow more people to have a little more flexibility to it. But it's at the same time, it's extremely costly for those direct marketing farmers and markets to operate those online sales platforms. So we're not sure if there's going to be the ability for them to actually pay for these online platforms in the long run. And that might be part of the reason why they stopped doing it. But they are definitely passionate about trying to keep that open as long as they can.
And Jimmy, you already mentioned that online shift happened for you. Maybe I could ask you to give us some insights on the food values. Like, do you have customers coming in particularly noting that the fact that you carry some locally grown products and stuff is important to them, and digging in for details, or is that something you don't see happening? And now that you're in Atlanta, do you see a difference in importance those customers place on food values?
Yeah, as far as customers here in our store, we certainly have an interest in that. We are able to source more of that local kind of product when the farmers market seasons are going on. We have about a 8 to 10 week season in the spring, and we're able to source some of that product, guys. So it begins a process where the customers know these guys from the markets, and then we sell that product, so they kind of connect the two together. But we try to carry everything we can locally. Our friends in Atlanta are very lucky to have a couple of suppliers up there that have some scale on a regular basis that are able to supply them with some products year round. Ours is more seasonal in the rural area. In Atlanta, we've got some urban gardens and some pretty cool stuff up there that are able to kind of supply those guys long term up there. If I share just a little bit real quick about the online business in general, certainly as I shared, we have our big sales increase, a tremendous amount of new users in the space. There are people who are now shopping online that possibly would have never shopped online or very infrequently anyway. So it pushed a lot of people. It has taken e-commerce in the grocery business at least at a warp speed of about 10 years versus, 1 year, what we typically would have taken about 10 years to do. So an increase there. We still have challenges with a lot of users in navigating technology. We see more of that on the senior side, and we do a good job on that, but there's still some, just the process of shopping online period is new to a lot of people. We still have a hard time selling fresh. When it comes to meat and produce, those are items that everyone still likes to see. That's the attraction of the farmers market here. They love to go out and interact with the farmers. So we still have some opportunities on that. And then a little bit about the SNAP program. One of the reasons that we applied for the pilot was to be able to serve rural areas. When I'm talking about rural areas, I'm talking about even outside of our area, in towns of 1,000 to 1,500 people that don't have a grocery store. And one of the components of that was to have a centralized place to drop off multiple orders. And with the shift in COVID, we were not able to do that. So we hope to revisit that one back in the fall. But e-commerce is here to stay. And I would agree with Dara, there's a lot to look at from an operational standpoint. Have you chosen the right partner, the cost and fees? But our nation and our consumer patterns have shifted dramatically in the last year. And e-commerce is going to be a huge piece in that going forward.
Great. It's so great to have you guys here kind of telling the stories that are behind this data. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit, because as you've heard several times already, one of the most interesting dimensions was how much local and regional food markets ended up being interconnected to the food security challenges that the country faced. So with that, we did decide to add some questions in the survey, and now I'm going to turn it over to Mackenzie to give you a couple insights about what they found related to those issues in our respondents.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dawn. So again, my name is Mackenzie. I'm a first-year PhD student at Colorado State University, and I'm going to highlight some implications for local and regional related to changes in food security that have occurred during the pandemic. So in our consumer survey, we asked respondents if at any time during the past year they had experienced food running out and they were not able to afford more. And if they reported experiencing this, we classified them as food insecure. So we found about 46% of our respondents reported experiencing this, which is higher than we would normally see. But other studies from 2020 also found that food insecurity was much higher than normal as well, which I can link those in the chat after I speak. So we're interested in how these dynamic changes in food security might impact consumers' food purchasing behavior. And before I go into the findings, I just want to briefly describe a few interesting characteristics of our food insecure population. So interestingly, only 58% of food insecure households were classified as low income, which meaning less than the median income. However, we only asked for respondents to report their annual income rather than by each time period after the onset of the pandemic. So additionally, 66% of food insecure households experienced a change in income or job after the onset of the pandemic. So these two observations together imply that a substantial number of our households are newly food insecure. And just in terms of other demographics, the food insecure households were comparable to the larger population in terms of household size, but we did see more minority populations represented here, with a 5% increase in the Black and Hispanic populations, as well as a 4% increase in the Asian and Pacific Islander populations. Okay, so the first finding that I want to highlight is that there are a substantial portion of food insecure households, so that light blue bar, that reported shopping at these local markets in the market channels in the last year. So especially, for example, if we look at farmers markets, we see that 61% of food insecure households reported shopping at farmers markets. And we think that increases in certain food assistance programs like the pandemic EBT dollars and SNAP online purchasing may have incentivized food insecure households to shop at sort of unconventional markets, especially when we consider programs like the Double Up Food Bucks program that promotes the sale of local fruits and vegetables to SNAP participants. And additionally, the SNAP online purchasing program gave assistance specifically for online food purchases. So households may have been incentivized to shop at a broad variety of market channels if they offered online purchasing options. All right, and then another major change that we observed during the course of the pandemic was changes in the way that we are spending our time. So studies have shown that at the onset of the pandemic, when we consider workers that were laid off or furloughed, as well as non-essential workers who began working from home, around 50% of the labor force was at home during the pandemic. And that's from a study that looked at April and May. So that may have fluctuated as the year went on. So we're interested in knowing how the changes in time might impact consumers' food choices and how this might differ for consumers who are food secure or food insecure. And so what we see here in this graph is that the food secure population experienced a larger change in the amount of time that they spent procuring and preparing. So basically shopping and cooking for food at home, as well as a decrease in the time they spent procuring food away from home. And contrastingly, we see that the food insecure population did not experience a substantial change in the time that they spent on food at home. Okay, so in this graph, now we are looking at only food insecure households, and we have separated them by those who reported spending at least 10% more time on procuring and preparing food at home. So that's the light blue bar, and those who did not. And so comparing the participation of SNAP and WIC, what we find is that households whose time restriction did not lessen, so in other words, they did not spend more time on food at home, most often used SNAP at that 56% participation. So SNAP is comparatively more accessible than WIC, as it has the capability for online registration, automated distribution of benefits, and had more emergency funds allocated in the form of like pandemic EBT dollars. So, and additionally, more food retailers accept SNAP than WIC, making it even more accessible. So our main takeaway here is that changes to the SNAP program to support online utilization may have had a beneficial effect on the time required for purchases with these benefits by food insecure households. And then it's worth noting also that there are plans in the works to modernize WIC and allow it to be more accessible and have more online utilization. And then in this last graph, we are comparing food acquisition methods in the same manner that we just saw. So again, for food insecure households, and the light blue bar represents those households whose time on food at home increased by at least 10%. And the major takeaway here is that food insecure households who did increase the time they spent procuring and preparing food at home were more likely to acquire food from food pantries and food banks, as well as much more likely to acquire food from school meal programs and other food assistance, which included like the commodity supplemental food program and Meals on Wheels. And so there were some concerns that school closures may have negatively impacted the time that it is required for families to get food. And we see evidence of that supported here with the major discrepancy between those food insecure households whose time increased were more likely to select the school meal programs. So generally, we have found that most food insecure households did not see a significant increase in the time they spent procuring and preparing food at home, and were most likely to acquire food using the most convenient and accessible food assistance programs. Emergency food assistance funding likely incentivized food insecure households' participation in direct from producer markets, especially if those markets offered online retail options. And in the near future, at least through September, we see PEBT dollars continuing. So we may expect the trend of food insecure households shopping at a variety of local markets to continue. And with that, I would love to hand it back to the panelists.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Great overview. And you all have been alluding to this in your other comments today too, but let's talk a little bit looking into the future about where you see farm market development and food security further aligning because of some of the dynamic that happened this year and some of the solutions for food security being in those local and regional food markets. Let's talk a little bit about where you see some future work in that area. And Andy, I think I'll have you start with that.
Yeah, so, for the last many years, the most effective tool we've had at directing local food to low-income, low-access communities has been the incentive programming through FINI and GusNIP. And in COVID year, we really saw the success of that program validated. In California, we're part of a statewide network. Here it's called Market Match, and that's run by the California Department of Agriculture and the Ecology Center. And in this year, I think across their almost 300 markets, they saw an increase of SNAP redemption around 40%, as well as 40% more shoppers. So we were happy to see in the recent stimulus package investment to an expansion of that program. It's not surprising that because SNAP went up that we saw increases in Market Match, but it's very validating and shows that there should be further investment. Anecdotally, in our own programs, we don't put a cap on, like others do, on the amount you can receive an incentive. And we saw amongst our shoppers that from 2019 to 2020, amongst SNAP shoppers, their average basket size doubled. And that has actually maintained till today. As far as our USDA project, though, the Farmers to Families Food Box Project, when we're talking about food security, we're really talking about food access. So for the prior years, the brunt of food access of local food has been incentive programs at farmers markets. What we saw in the USDA program was the creation of a new channel for local farmers to reach low-income populations, low-access populations, where in a given year, my own program through farmers market work does around $300,000 of impact in the local food system. In 2020, our network coordinated $3 million of purchasing from farmers. And the way we did that was by activating other nonprofits to become value chain coordinators. So these were nonprofits, urban farms, and they took on the traits of food hubs. So they were building supply chains, and they were also building distribution channels into low access, low income communities. So we feel that there should be further investment and ongoing investment into hunger relief amongst local food systems, because we believe if you make that channel exist from farm to hub to low-income communities, you can start layering on programming to eventually create new consumer behavior and get folks familiar with how they might access or get folks familiar with local food and train up a new type of food hub that can become a value chain coordinator between those communities and farmers.
Yeah, it's just inspiring to think of what might happen, but it's always a what might. Jimmy or Dar, do you want to weigh in on this topic at all?
Sure.
This vision of where you see farm, and in your case, grocery markets aligning with the food security movement more fully.
Yeah, we look forward to continuing to be a part of this important process, and Alabama will be rolling out the PEBT program this summer as schools close. We continue to look to find innovative ways to serve the online SNAP customers, especially in those rural areas that we're talking about. We're always open to work with our local farmers and distributors. What we found in Alabama is that we've got a really well-run network of state farmers markets, and those partnerships with the growers are, where the grower is essentially growing enough product to sell it at those markets and not doing a lot of extra production or anything. So we got a lot of opportunities there, but we love the local food movement. Just like we're a local grocer, we want to partner with all the local families, either growing or producing products, and that be a part of this solution for our food security.
Yeah, I think really quickly, I mean, you guys, Andy and Jimmy, have said a lot of really important pieces. As I said in the chat, shelf-stable goods being available for shoppers so that it's not just fruit, veg that they can buy, but other things at farmers markets through their incentive and SNAP dollars is really key. And so many of the match programs are limiting to just fruits and veg and not to the other items, which we think is not a great trend. I think also to Annie's point about more sites being available to get access local food is so important, and that farmers markets can do its job, which and one of its best jobs it has is to be the introductory point for those looking for those relationships and in that new community space to access local food and learn about it and feel like they're part of a community and change their health behavior over a long period of time. And if we can find more ways to bring in local food in through these different channels, farmers markets can really focus on those things that they do well, including, like I said, being the way that many people find local food for the first time on these programs.
And just to quickly add on that, Dar, one of our partners, Agricultural Institute of Marin, is a farmers market association out here, and they were under our box program, and they were supporting their farmers market farms, packing at the market and distributing it. And that model worked super well and supported a lot of their farms.
Yeah, great insights to all of you. Well, as you can tell, we're butting up to our time, so let's just do some closing comments and then have one more talk with the panel. So this is not from our survey, but instead a consultancy group put this out, talking about where they see some potential pathways to normalization through 2021. We're obviously all seeing evidence of that so far. But this just kind of gives us some context of as we seek to build better beyond, where our restaurant partners are probably going to start seeing some normalization, but also, maybe based on the discussion today, what do we want the new normal to be? And so let's talk about that a little bit. Sarah mentioned this already, and Haley, that when we had our listening sessions with these partners back in summer 2020, when no one knew what was going to happen, one of their really big questions, and this was common across all 16 partners, was, are these people going to stick around? Are these new customers going to stick around? And at least at first, our initial evidence is a lot of them are going to. For those people who tried a new market in April 2020, when we asked if they were still using that market in September, depending on the market, between 30 and 40% were still staying with that new market channel. So we may see some people and households who change their food buying habits. And I think, we've heard some great stories and insights today about what we possibly can do to stabilize that as much as possible. We did ask in the survey about the intentions to use market channels in the future. we took out the huge block of people who said they're going to do the same thing. But what we focused on is the share on the right-hand side in green that plan to use some market channels even more so going into the future versus those on the left-hand side in blue bars of those they intend to use less in the future. And we have some potential winners there. Those meal kits look like they're going to have some persistence. Farmers markets, super centers, although they're doing fine before the pandemic, food boxes, direct from producer. So again, this is encouraging news that beyond that persistence of people who've changed their habits, there are people still seeking out new solutions and really kind of hitting a reset button about how they interact with their food system. So let's end the day, and people, we know people need to peel off. We do appreciate if you can participate in the survey where we're evaluating how you're using this series in your work. But let's end the day with having each of the panelists again, one by one, talk the most broadly possible about what patterns they think will persist post-pandemic and what innovations you're particularly focusing on to build better beyond as we normalize post-pandemic. So this time, let's have Jimmy start.
Okay, sure. We certainly see safety. We always have pride ourselves on cleanliness. Certainly see food safety and personal safety as being prevalent going forward. We have, as I shared earlier, we've held on to a lot of our business. We hope to keep that. We are trying to determine two things. Our big initiatives are growing e-commerce. How do we take this wave in e-commerce mind, especially with SNAP customers? And the second thing is we're entering into the arena of food service. You know, we certainly see the challenges that restaurants have, but the grab and go meal segment, whether it be meal kits or hot meals to go, is something we see great potential. And so we're looking at exploring those opportunities. I think that it's the new normal is be that a customer that likes the small market like we have, and we look forward to being able to have a model that's relevant.
Thanks much. How about you, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I said it a couple times, but one, in continuing to invest in GusNIP, it's a super successful model. And two, you know, when we're thinking about emergency feeding projects, I want us to just think about them beyond just emergency feeding projects and as a real opportunity to not let those connections go to waste. There's a real opportunity for all of the people who are reached with local food boxes to permanently invite them into the local food system, whether that's education about getting to farmers markets, education about using benefits at farmers markets, or even creating permanent channels to the purchase of local food from new food hub type organizations. And though I didn't touch on this, there's an overlapping or a similar system in upcoming in food as medicine programming, which we anticipate going everywhere through the healthcare system and really making a concerted effort, again, for local farmers to be prepared to jump on that opportunity. So it comes to the local food system. And again, not thinking of it just as an emergency nonprofit type effort, but an opportunity to really bring more people in who haven't been part of the local food system historically.
Well said. And Dar, we'll let you make the final comments for the day before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think Jimmy and Andy said much of the really great innovations we're seeing. Certainly in farmers market, we want farmers markets to focus on, to understand what the other channels around them are doing. This is the kind of stuff that we are new to. How is, you know, food and local food being purchased outside of farmers markets? I think we have a better understanding of that. I definitely think that markets as centers of innovation around these ideas of market box programs or pre-order or curbside, that will continue. Direct marketing farmers as leapfrogging into technology is obviously a huge trend that we're seeing.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Let's give a virtual round of applause to our panelists and all our speakers for today. I know we covered a lot, and again, that's why we just continue to share links with you about where you can do a deeper dive if we went too fast. And we do also want to invite you all to join us for our last webinar in the series, which will be May 17th coming up, same time, same place, on as we look beyond this even discussion around the survey, but our next steps to support local food systems in the broadest framing possible. Given we know we're going to continue to see some uncertainty in consumer behavior and really trying to track what's going to stay and what's going to evolve. So thank you all for joining us today. We'll stick around and keep the room open for anybody who wants any last questions answered or links again that we can share. But we so appreciate you coming today. We appreciate whatever role and hat you're wearing in the food system. And we hope you continue to engage with our project and take the lessons we're learning from people on the ground making these success stories work. So thank you for coming today, and we hope to see you again soon.